I'm Randy, the pastor half of the podcast, and my friend Kyle's a philosopher. This podcast hosts conversations at the intersection of philosophy, theology, and spirituality.
We also invite experts to join us, making public a space that we've often enjoyed off-air, around the proverbial table with a good drink in the back corner of a dark pub.
Thanks for joining us, and welcome to A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk Into a Bar.
So on this episode, we're talking to a philosopher named Keith DeRose, who is a professor at Yale University. And I actually met Keith almost 10 years ago. I went to presented a paper at a philosophy conference in California, and he happened to be the keynote there. And he's been an influential voice in epistemology, which is my field, particularly for a view called contextualism, which comes up a little bit in the interview. He's kind of known for that, but he works on several other things too. And recently he's been working on philosophy of religion, which has been an interest of his all along, I think it sounds like. And you actually mentioned him first, which is weird because having known about him and liking his work and having taught it, he's not someone I ever would have thought of to invite. And so it's funny that you thought of him first, and it was in our episode on hell. Mm-hmm. And so you can kind of view this episode as a part 2 to that. So if you haven't heard that one, maybe stop this one and go listen to that first. And we invited him on to kind of continue that conversation a little bit because he's a proponent of a view that you hold, Randy, called Universalism, or as you put it, ultimate reconciliation. I'm not a proponent of that view, but it's a view I'd very much like to be true. And so I was hoping that we could have somebody on who could tell me why I'm wrong.
Yeah, and I think we'll have more guests who can tell you why you're wrong at that one.
Yeah.
In particular about ultimate reconciliation. We'll talk to Brad Jersak again. I'd love to talk to William Paul Young about it and a number of others. But in this episode, we don't just talk about ultimate reconciliation or Christian universalism. There's also a good bit about certainty, why Keith has a problem with Christian funerals. There's all sorts of things that are a little bit juicy tidbits. So what are we drinking today, Kyle?
Yeah, so one of the things we like to do on this podcast is have a beverage before every conversation to really accentuate the bar theme of the show. And I had a really long work week, and so I decided I'm going to open something good. And so this is maybe, I don't want to say it's my favorite bourbon, but it's probably in my top 5. Not in terms of like best bourbon in the world, crazy hard to find, but just like favorite go-to. This is the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof. And if you're rolling your eyes thinking Elijah Craig, it's probably because you've only had the small batch, and it's nothing like that. It's nothing like that. So the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof it's released 3 times a year. So this is the B522, which means it was released in May of 2022, and it's the second batch of the year. That's what the B means. This is 121 proof and 12 years old and freaking delicious.
I have had it, and I will second that.
That's funny. You had a long work week. It's Thursday as we record.
It is. And it has been a long, long 4 days, man.
Well, we get to benefit from it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it has everything I love in a bourbon. It's exactly the right strength. It's exactly the right amount of barrel, exactly the right amount of age, exactly the right amount of depth. There's the caramel in there that I love. There's sweetness, but not too much. There's dark fruits. There's the tiniest bit of smoke. It's just wonderful.
Bright spices on the end, like on the tip of my tongue, actually, towards the end. I really like that. Yeah, I won't say this is my favorite or perfect bourbon, but it shocked me because I was one of those people who are like, Elijah Craig, what are we bottom shelving it tonight? Or mid shelf. For me, that's mid shelf.
Sure, yeah.
And then all of a sudden I tried this stuff and I was blown away.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts, Elliot? This is your first time, I think?
That's great. You said it's a little smoky.
A tiny bit, yeah.
I get
a
bunch, and I love it. And the dark cherry flavors are my favorite. But I get what you're saying too about the bright spices. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. This is, it's not an easy bottle to find anymore, unfortunately, because everybody knows. But if you can find it, it's worth it, and it'll probably maybe run you $80 if you find it on a shelf. But I think it's a very fair price.
Which I was going to say, I don't spend $80 on bottles of alcohol. I just don't do it. But there's way more expensive stuff that's not as good as this.
Yeah, I've had $150 bottles that I don't like.
Yep.
Nearly as well.
Yeah, so I think in the grand scheme of things, this is not a badly priced. This is a great priced bourbon, actually.
Yeah, I actually just read, sadly, they're removing the age statements because they're running out of their stock, which was a totally foreseeable problem. And so starting this year, I think they're no longer going to have that 12-year statement on it. So each batch is going to be a little bit different. We'll see if it stays as good. I don't know.
I'm guessing it will.
We'll see. I hope you're
They're
right.
smart people. So one more time, what is this?
This is Elijah Craig, Barrel Proof. Cheers.
Yeah, to hard weeks.
Let's read a review. One of the things we like to do when we get reviews is feature some of them on the show. Encourages you guys to leave more. This is actually an email we got, so we're totally open to emails as well. So this is from Colin. Colin says, Randy and Kyle, just wanted to take a second and say a big thank you for doing this podcast. I came across it accidentally late last year and binged every episode in the course of a couple of months. It very quickly became one of my favorite podcasts. I absolutely love the open dialogue you have with people from different backgrounds and how you're able to disagree respectfully with each other on the podcast. I've been on a bit of a deconstruction journey out of independent fundamentalist Baptist circles for a couple of years now.
Praise the Lord.
And what you've talked through really helped me to feel more settled in uncertainty without needing an absolute answer right away.
There you go.
Also, thank you, 3 thank yous, for recommending Heaven's Door Whiskey. Can't find the episode it was on, but I've kept a note on anything you've drunk that interested me. I don't think I got the exact one you were drinking, but it led me to their rye aged in cigar barrels.
Dang.
Yeah. And that immediately shot to the top of my rye list and pretty high on my whiskey list. Keep up the great work. I've eagerly shared the podcast with several friends and look forward to continuing to learn with you.
Colin,
Wow.
cheers.
Cheers.
Where do we get some of this rye?
I know.
Keith DeRose, thank you so much for joining us on A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk Into a Bar.
It's nice being with you guys.
Yeah, Keith, we've been excited to talk to you for a while. Can you just kind of locate yourself for our listeners, who you are, what work you do? You're at Yale, I believe. And then also your spiritual landscape. Like, what did you grow up with in any faith tradition, and where are you now, since we are A Pastor and Philosopher Walk Into a Bar?
Yeah, so I grew up in the Dutch sub-community in the south side of Chicago. So
Okay.
the Christian Reformed Church, if you know, it's the more evangelical of the two. I think it's the CRC
Yep.
and the RCA, the Reformed Church of America. And if you're trying to find me and my people, whenever there's a split, you just make a hard right and you'll come back. And I went to Calvin College, which was, even if life in general isn't all predetermined, that was.
Calvinist jokes are the best jokes.
Yeah, they are.
That's right. I went there as my father before me and his father before him did. Then I went to UCLA for graduate school. I just kind of stumbled blindly into the place where Marilyn Adams was, who Kyle mentioned in previous podcasts. We got to study with her and Bob. I ended up not doing philosophy of religion as my main thing. And I got my degree and taught first at NYU and then at Rice. And then since 1998, so a long old time, at Yale, where I've worked mainly in epistemology and philosophy of language, but have finally, in the last few years, gotten to some work I've been wanting to do from the beginning in philosophy of religion. So I'm writing a book on the problem of evil. So I just have to solve that, and I'll be done with my career.
Dang, now I want to, if I would have known that, I would have had all sorts of different questions.
Oh, we're going to talk about that.
Okay, good. Awesome. And are you still part of the Reformed Church, or what's that for you?
Yeah, no. So when I graduated from Calvin, seniors was showing where they were going on their hand, because this is how they do the Michigan.
Yep.
And I think it was completely intentional that I ended up going to UCLA. So I would have to tell them, I'm falling off the edge of the earth. And I think I was trying to get away culturally, religiously, socially, in about in every way as far away as I could. But, I have family who've stayed in. And so, I've stayed somewhat connected. Here at Yale, we just happened to go to a weird little Episcopal church. And I think it's probably not coincidental. They have a lot of people from evangelical backgrounds. So I can't really get away, try as I might. But the parts of Calvinism that would be important to a philosopher, I think I'm about, as far away from that as you can get.
Good news.
It was, yeah, well, they had me read, of course, at Calvin, they had us read Calvin's Institutes. And I figured out later what they really needed, since, I don't think Calvin had a philosophical bone in his body. What they really needed was to have me read Jonathan Edwards. Because he was like a real philosopher. And God only knows what would have happened if they had me read him. But as it happened, I got him, several years later. And I realized, although I end up about as far away from him as you can get, I guess I'm an open theist, so. But I found myself like agreeing with almost all his arguments, which were basically wiping out the middle ground. And I was with him, that middle ground is no good. But he just, from my point of view, then chose the wrong extreme.
Yeah. He'd probably say the same about you. So where do you land religiously now? So we've emailed back and forth a bit before this episode. I've emailed more with you than I have with any other guest we've ever had on the show, which is awesome.
Super fun.
Really good stuff. And you shared a bunch of stuff that you've written, which was super helpful. And in one of those pieces, you describe yourself as a semi-agnostic.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to start by asking you to explain what that means, because it resonated with me. I don't know if I would use the label, but I like it, and I kind of want you to talk me into it.
Yeah, well, so I always thought agnostic has come to mean something like someone who takes themselves not to know. And I certainly count as an agnostic in that sense. I take myself not to know even that God exists. Yeah. If you get doubters in the church, the people will often send them to me, because look, he doubts too. And usually what happens is these are folks who have like doubts about this or that doctrine. And then when they run into me, they find like doubts about things they weren't looking to find doubts about.
Yeah, just makes it worse.
Yeah, but it also seemed to me there was an important sense in which I wasn't an agnostic. And so I took that to be something like someone who doesn't even take a position on the issue. So, and I'm not an agnostic in that sense. I like to use, instead of believe, because I don't think I really believe either. But I like to use accept.
Yeah.
And I accept that. And I think that's the same position I take towards other controversial philosophical positions I take, including things I'm known for taking. Right. So even as I say in some places, when people know me in the profession as a contextualist about knowledge attributions, I say, well, I accept theism in the same way that I accept contextualism. When I'm into it, it feels like something I know. It certainly feels like something I believe. There's like a sincere acceptance here. But I take myself to be nowhere near to knowing and wonder about whether I really believe. So I think it's best described as acceptance. And I think maybe for a lot of people who have left the church over doubts, that such a position, a semi-agnostic in that sense, could be something that they could, see their way clear to becoming.
Sure.
And since I'm not in the business of trying to reel people into the church, even if they don't become, it could become a point of contact I have with them. I'm not really that different from you. I don't take myself to know either. I've cast my lot with this. but I don't take myself to know that I did that rightly. And so I have a lot of course, in my profession, and not teaching in a Christian school, I have like a lot of professional colleagues who are further away from belief than I am. And it's just, I think it's helpful to have a stance, which in many ways is somewhat like theirs and something they could see themselves adopting. Even if they're not going to, they can see it. So it helps to relate to a lot of people.
Yeah.
So you hinted at this just now, and then you said it kind of explicitly in our communications, but your stance of semi-agnosticism, you said, maybe this is a way back in, or a way for people to stay who are struggling with their faith. I love that. I really love being able to provide people with language for what's going on inside of them, while maybe not abandoning faith altogether. What's your relationship with the church? Sounds like you're, pardon the pun, fairly agnostic about it. But also, like, do you care that people stay engaged spiritually or ecclesiologically?
Yes, I care, but I'm hesitant to encourage. I should say, I think I've said this, I think in communications with Kyle, if I'm remembering, this was all a couple of weeks ago. I don't want to come off as telling people, jump in, the water is fine, because if you're uncertain in the way I am, in various ways, church, or at least the churches I know, is really not set up for you. This comes out for me most clearly at funerals, which seem to me to be like certainty fests, right? Everybody's walking around, well, at least we know where so-and-so is. That party, I'm like, yeah, that's my problem. I don't, that's part of why it's so sad. For all I know, they are gone forever, and I'm never seeing them again. And that's certainly part of why I'm so sad. And this is the part where I would never say this part, but this is kind of what's going on in my head. Things turn a little nasty when you get from the person's own uncertainty, like somebody who feels quite uncertain about religious matters, but is in the church anyway. Well, that's one thing, but things turn nasty, a little bit nastier when you get to what they must be thinking of the people around them who seem far more certain, because it's probably not, boy, these folks are all certain, I wish I could be. I guess that could happen, but I think it's much more likely to be kind of like what I have, where you kind of suspect the certainty of the people around you is kind of phony. You think it's not a nice thing to think about people, and you think, deep down, they're kind of worried. They seem at the funeral, they seem really sad. I think if they knew what they said they knew, it wouldn't be such a sad thing.
Yeah, so it's funny you mentioned that. I was just at a funeral this week, a few days ago, and family member, and I thought about this because you had emailed me that just a couple of weeks ago, and I'd been thinking about it, and so I was presently thinking about and watching for signs of that kind of certainty and the kinds of language that were being used during the eulogy, and the pastor, who was a pastor of a kind of conservative evangelical denomination and whatever. And honestly, I came away with maybe a different read of it. I don't think it's incompatible necessarily, but I think I view it as everybody there kind of knows, maybe not in a philosophical sense of no, all right? So it's not like they could justify it or make an argument for it, but like everybody knows that they don't know. And if they contemplated it, they'd probably acknowledge that that is a big part of why they're sad. But they at least performatively believe that what we're doing here is a kind of exhortation. It's like convincing ourselves with the liturgy and with the language from this tradition that we all participate in, that this is true, and that we can use each other's feigned confidence as a kind of emotional and spiritual support. And I think that's what's going on, whether it might be cognitively available or not. And I'm actually very much okay with it. This is what I discovered this week. Like sitting there knowing that I didn't believe anything that was being said, I still felt very much at peace with its being said, if that makes sense. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, that's certainly a much nicer read of the situation. I mean, it could be like we're facing different situations, but it strikes me it's more likely we're facing the same situation, and I'm having a more cynical take on it. And that wouldn't be out of character for me. But yeah, I have the same feeling often, like when we recite the creed, a creed, I believe this, I believe that. And, it sounds like very confident, very definite belief, but that strikes me as like not such a bad thing. It feels kind of aspirational. And, I guess I don't really believe, but in a way it'd be nice to. And, I guess aspirational is the way to put it. It seems a bit different to me at funerals because there the expressions of certainty seem to have as their point to comfort. I'd be very comforted if I could be certain of this. The problem is I can't be. And if it's a loved one of mine, someone really close to me who's died, you're not going to make me feel better by saying, well, certain where they are, because I'm just not. And and to be told, at least we can be certain of it when I'm not. And that's really the problem. I feel like, for me, and I know I'm unusual and these shouldn't be designed around me, but for me, what I would most benefit from is some kind of acknowledgement that we're all like really sad here in part because we're just not sure.
And I mean, as a pastor and as a person who used certainty as a tool, because really certainty is a preaching mechanism that makes you come off very authoritative, very confident, and very compelling in some ways. Like when you introduce any qualifiers, it kind of loses its power a little bit. So I get the attraction. I've done it. I've since repented of that, and I would like to think that. We talk about certainty and faith all the time at our church. But what I'm trying to say is that there's a way to do church in a way that doesn't become a certainty fest. And I think there's even a way to do funerals in a way that aren't certainty fests. It's not, I would never as a pastor stand up and be like, well, we all know that we don't know where she is. Like that would be pastorally bad. But we can, I love hearkening to the scriptures and talking about Jesus saying, I am the resurrection and the life. If anyone believes in me, they will have life eternal. Do you believe this? And then you can talk about things like hope. Like hope can fill a lot of space that certainty usually does, but doesn't really have to. So I just want to say that there's different ways of embodying what we believe, and in the church as pastors and even as congregants, the way we talk. I really do think that, I think there are some people who know that this is not certain, but they say it anyways. But I do think there's people who are completely in the dark about how faith does not equal certainty. I mean, and the evidence for that is on Christian Twitter. Whenever I talk about that we're not certain of this, this is what we believe, people just go sideways and they can't handle it. And they think that I'm a complete heretic, or they have no grid for understanding that belief does not equal certainty. So I think there is, and comes from the top down in the church, I think there is this complete gap between understanding reality, that our faith and our beliefs are different from what we know and can know. Yeah. So keep up the good work, Keith.
Well, if you're telling me, continue with your cynical takes on what's happening around you.
And maybe don't say that at a funeral, perhaps. But
don't ever preach a funeral.
Yeah, I should never, ever, ever be a preacher. That's for sure.
Yeah, don't give any eulogies.
Yes.
Like that.
So switching gears off of certainty in our correspondence, and by ours, I mean yours and Kyle's, and I just got to read it. Sorry if you didn't know that I was reading it, but I was. You called yourself a Good Friday Christian, and that intrigued me a little bit. Can you tell us what you mean by a Good Friday Christian and why you call yourself a Good Friday Christian?
Well, so first of all, it's in contrast to Easter, which I also have problems with. And behind funerals, Easter is like one of my toughest days at church, and it's all the triumphalism, and there it has a lot to do with the church's position. It varies from church to church, but I think we can speak generally of the Christian church's position on what happens to the bulk of humankind. And it's not nice, And so I have a hard time even understanding what we can even mean by our Pauline Easter taunt, where death is now thy sting. I'm like, what do you mean, where is it sting? It stings like hell, according to the position we take, and you can think, well, me and mine will be okay, but as long as I say this advisedly, as long as you give a damn about the other people, it's got to sting. I mean, look at the church's position. Death ends the chances for salvation.
Some believe.
For people that God really wanted to save. But now death has ended their chances. If I were deaf, I wouldn't be too hurt by that taunt. I'd say, where's my sting? Look right over there, that person who God wanted to save, and I put an end to that.
So you're not a fan of what happens in what gets talked about on Easter. What about Good Friday is attractive to you?
I love Good Friday services. I don't know at this point what exactly I sent that you saw, but I had a thing, I think, where I wrote about this just like on a Facebook note back when they had notes. But I had the front cover of Marilyn Adams' book, Horrendous Evils, and I'm blanking out. It's like one of the most important books.
I've got it right here. And the Goodness of God.
And the Goodness of God. And the Goodness of God. That's it. I can't blank out on that. I got to go with that. And it's got, a picture of some art with a gruesome Christ on the cross, obviously suffering horribly. That I really, that's what I resonate with. And I think it's largely because I take, the problem of horrific suffering to be, the greatest challenge to theistic belief. And I realize that I've become, strangely addicted, to a form of theism where, if I had to give this up, I wouldn't try to find the nearest branch of theism that didn't have this. I would just be gone. I mean, my backup position is death is the end naturalism, and that's where I'd be gone to. But the one form of theism that I can take, and that I do take, is one where, God has somehow managed to get themselves tortured to death. And I think that's largely because, that's so central to how I think the problem of horrific suffering has to be dealt with in a Christian setting. And so in Good Friday, when that's remembered, that's like the annual center of my Christian life. So it's kind of, I guess it's a kind of sad outlook. I hate Easter and I love Good Friday. So.
That is hilarious, and I enjoy it at the same time. It's a very rare take. Can I just ask one follow-up question real quick, Keith? You said there's something about God suffering a gruesome death and kind of having all this evil and violence put on God's self. What significance does that, like, why is that so significant to you? Can you flesh that out a little bit?
Yeah, that's like really hard to flesh out. But that's really behind the stuff I am writing now. And as I'm like getting toward the end of the book on the problem of horrific suffering. But I think I'm far from alone in having, from the beginning of my Christian life, just being most moved, by the ends of the Gospels. And that's, if anything can be picked out of the crowd as what was the strongest draw to the faith for me, it's just the accounts of Christ's suffering and death. So in the end, and that's so important because although I have not undergone any horrific suffering, I worry a lot about all the horrific suffering that has been happening. And I'm thinking, some kind of identification with the suffering of Christ has got to be part of the story about, why God allows it to happen.
Yeah. Yep.
Not that you can fill out that story in any, or at least not that I can fill out that story in any very convincing way. But I think I can see that without that, there just is no story to tell. For my money, you just give up the game at that point. Yeah. So however good or bad it is at saving the game is lost without it.
It reminds me of the quote, I think it's from Night by Elie Wiesel, talking about a young boy in a concentration camp being hung and watching this dead boy for like a half hour after he died, and the members of the concentration camp, and one of them says, "Where is God? Where the F is God right now?" And someone says, "Where is he? He's here. He's here hanging in the gallows." It kind of reminds me of that spirit. But let me change gears a little bit, Keith. One of the main reasons that you came onto my radar, or the main reason you came onto my radar, is that a couple months ago, I told my church that I believe in Christian Universalism, that I've gotten to the point, I've been on a journey about what I think about hell, what I think about people's eternal destinies, all that business. And I've come to a point, because of the scriptures, because of church fathers, because of my experience as a dad, all sorts of things, to a point where I think that all people will wind up saved. And as I said that to my church, one person in particular was a little bit disturbed and had some questions for me, and they were really great questions. But then he did what I wish every church person would do, is he went home and did some research on his own. And he emailed me back at about 4:00 that same Sunday and said, "Hey, I want to tell you, I did some research and I found that this is not such a crazy aberrant view, and that there is lots of scripture." And then he forwarded me a link to an article by some Yale philosopher who explained why he's a Christian Universalist. And it turns out to be you. So he found your article and it was super helpful for him. So I want to say thank you. Can you tell us, you grew up...
You say 4 p.m. 4 o'clock.
Yeah, he spent 4 whole hours.
I did, yep. You started out in the Dutch Reformed Church, which obviously is not Christian Universalism, and now you are writing articles and saying that you're a Christian Universalist. How did you get there? And just what brought you to that place where you would identify, if you would identify, as a Christian Universalist?
When I got to UCLA, so this was first year graduate school. I'm, I guess, 22, just having finished Calvin College. And Marilyn and Bob Adams, two Christian philosophers who were teaching in the UCLA philosophy department, they were running a Bible study at their house. I believe I'm remembering on Sunday evenings. And they were going through the book of Romans. And I remember when I started going that I was, I guess, a Universalist at the time, but I thought that I just couldn't see being a Christian without that. But I thought, it was pretty clearly against what was in the New Testament, and it was, the Adamses and some others in that Bible study, as maybe it was providential. They were going through Romans when I came in, started to convince me that at least it wasn't so clear that this was against Scripture, and actually started bringing me around to saying, yeah, it seems like probably the best take available on Scripture. At least Pauline letters. And so I guess I reconstruct from that by the time I was done at college, I was a Universalist of sorts, at least. I think, I was just basically feeling that the version of the faith I grew up in, there was something really wrong, and not knowing exactly, what kind of alternative there could be. But, part of my thinking that it was so wrong was, the doctrine of hell, which is, like really nasty in itself. But when you combine it with predestination, the result is a noxious brew far nastier than the sum of the nastiness of the parts. So yeah, I think worries about hell were very central to my feeling that there was something wrong with the religious position I was brought up in. And, this wasn't so much my parents, because I don't think they talked much about hell. But it's you're in the church. I'm in the CR, and not only going to a CRC church, but CRC schools, all the way up through grade school, middle school, high school, and then to Calvin College. So I think I was ready for UCLA at that point. There I am, a Chicago kid coming out of Grand Rapids, and I'm living in a place with palm trees. And going to Bible study where most of the people thought the bulk of humankind wasn't going to suffer horrifically forever. So it was all a nice change.
So you must have, did you study philosophy at Calvin?
Yes, I was a philosophy major.
So surely there were faculty there at the time that were at least friendly to the idea or open to the idea?
Well, I since became colleagues with one of my teachers. So he pretty much admitted to me, I think even all these years after leaving Calvin, it still couldn't, even speaking just to me, couldn't say, well, I think I'm with you. I think you're right. I don't think, I don't believe the doctrine of hell. I'm actually, I don't think he could do that. I mean, it wasn't like worries, but, people at Calvin, teaching at Calvin, can't say stuff like that, no matter how much particular student might need to hear it, because, you lose your job.
Yeah.
And this philosopher, who I guess anybody can go online and find out who would have been my teacher at Calvin and then a Yale colleague.
Sure.
But I guess that's okay. He'd been like gone for years, I think, and it wasn't like worries about like losing his job or anything. He's like gone. Right. I think it's just like some kind of institutional loyalty.
Yeah.
To the denomination, and it's like you just can't come out and clearly say stuff that's so set against the accepted doctrine.
Yeah. So let's so the main thing we wanted to talk to you about was this Christian Universalism and hell. And you've heard our episode where you came up and at the end of it. And so this is in some ways a kind of a part 2 to that. And kind of what I wanted to focus on a little bit is why I'm not, which you heard the reasons, and get your rebuttals. So
yes, I said and I took it from that episode that's specifically what I was being brought in.
Yeah, you're here to refute me. Yeah, and I'll be happy to be refuted about this more than any other philosophical position I hold. So my main reasons for holding out, as I said in that episode, are kind of 3 things, and in some ways there may be 1 or 2 things. There's free will, so I want to talk a little bit about that. What is the role of free will vis-a-vis universalism in your view? There's what I called habituation, which is this idea that you can so solidify your character in a contrary direction from God that it's simply impossible to get out of it, even with an endless amount of time and opportunity to do so. And then there's evil. There's the problem of evil and theodicies, which try to answer the problem of evil. And my view is that Christian Universalism, I don't know if I would say it exacerbates the problem of evil, but I don't think it helps. And in some ways, I think it is a form of theodicy and therefore suffers the fate, in my view, of all theodicies, which is that they don't work. So those are kind of my reasons for holding out. And also, I just kind of see in myself the tendencies toward that habituation thing. And so it's really easy for me to believe that there are people who would, of their own volition, reject God forever. So it's not that I think God couldn't save everybody if everybody was willing to be saved, or that God doesn't want to. It's that I think people just don't want to be, or some of them at least. And so for that reason, I'm a holdout. I'm a skeptic, and so I'm hoping you can convince me otherwise. So pick wherever you want to start there.
On the habituation point, I certainly just want to agree that I take this to be like one of the main points that C.S. Lewis was driving at, particularly in the novel The Great Divorce. Mm-hmm. And I certainly agree that there is a successful account of how somebody remaining psychologically continuous with the way we are in this life could get themselves worked into a position where they would, I think of it as like being stuck in some horrible rut where you've got yourself, I don't know, what's the Lewis phrase? Is something like choosing against joy or something? Mm-hmm. And certainly someone could get into that position, and that's a coherent account of how it could happen, that somebody could freely choose to remain forever separated from God, even with, maybe coming to have full knowledge of what they're choosing against, or at least as full knowledge as is possible for us to have.
Yeah.
But I just don't see why that should make us think anybody's ever going to be in that position. Because I guess I just see the purpose of this life. If you think that there is, an afterlife, and that for many people it will be an afterlife of, never-ending joy, that's got to affect, pretty radically your view of what this life must be for. And if you think the life to come is going to be, is not going to have like horrific, or what's the John Hicks term for it, or dysteleological suffering, or apparently pointless
gratuitous
suffering, I won't have any of that. Yeah, then I think you have to view this earthly life. Part of the main point of it's got to be from a theistic perspective of that type. has got to be to allow us to realize the values that can only be realized in the face of horrific evil.
Yeah.
I think such a person should think. So such a person who believes in an afterlife where at least many people will enjoy unending joy with God, then you should think that what this world is like should lead to the conclusion that there is no God if given the assumption, which you don't make, that this life is all there is.
Mm-hmm.
And given all that, for me, the only chance to make sense, I'll put it that way, for us to make sense of God's allowing the horrific suffering is going to involve, I think, not just an afterlife where many people enjoy such unending joy, but pretty much it's got to be where everybody does.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you should think in that sense that how God would arrange the basic structure of our earthly life is going to be radically different if this is a preamble to something greater that's to come, as opposed to this being the whole show.
Right.
And if you think it is just a preamble to what's to come, you should think it won't make sense as being the whole show. The problem of horrific suffering should be a theism killer if you can add to it that this life is all there is. That's what you should think. If you're a theist who believes in heaven, basically, and then you'll think, and I think this is should be unsurprising. You really need the afterlife, and you need pretty much everybody getting to heaven in order to make sense of people being put through this life. Yeah, and I want to agree though with Kyle that if your thought is something like universalism must be true because God is good, and that's like the only way for things to go that can make sense of there being a good God. I agree with Kyle that you should really be kind of stopped in your tracks and made to be quite uncertain of that inference by the fact that there's such horrific evil in this life, because you should admit, I wouldn't have thought a good God would allow that. And I'm certainly turned out to be wrong about that. So I should be quite uncertain about any inferences I want to draw about what must happen after we die, because that's how God would have to do it. Because, it's certainly true that the horrific evils of this world show us all that God doesn't operate in the way we would expect a good being to operate in terms of what he allows.
Sure. So would you say that universalism is a kind of theodicy, or does it have a theodicy twist to it?
Yeah. So I noted in what you were saying on the earlier hell episode of your podcast, that there's certainly, I don't know if you're getting it from the literature, if you have it independently, but there is like this kind of anti-theodicy movement almost. People in certain circles, it's like very, I wanted to say fashionable, but that would be like, I don't know. I shouldn't put it that way, but there's
whatever the opposite position from mine is always the fashionable one.
Yeah, right, you're in the fashionable one. Yeah, and I'm bravely standing against the current fashions. That there's something really wrong with the project of theodicy, and that to the point that it can be seen as like almost disgusting and failing to take seriously how horrible some of the evils of this world are. And if you think you can get up there and give reasons why a God might allow it, you're just failing to take it seriously. And it's like a disgusting effort that really makes things worse. I mean, the paper I associate with this movement is by, it looks like a Greek guy because his name is Nick Trakakis. And I noticed in your Hell episode, there was some issue about the pronunciation of the Greek doctrine. And that got tied somehow. Now you got to remember, I'm listening to this on my iPod in the gym, but got tied somehow to the name of the Greek Milwaukee Buck basketball player. And whose name I can't even, Antetokounmpo.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, maybe lay theologians, and certainly those in Milwaukee, might just take to doing what basketball fans do with that hard to pronounce Greek name for the doctrine, and just call it Giannis. But Nick Trakakis, his paper was theodicy: the solution to the problem of evil or part of the problem. And so that's all, and I certainly I understand the hesitation, but I think when you think about what theodicy would be, and you think about just how compelling the argument against God's existence from the argument from horrific suffering, just how compelling that argument can be. And I think you see, as distasteful as it might seem, it looks like, we really need it. Something that could be called theodicy, because the argument as it stands, I think is like a killer argument with no response. And basically a theodicy can be seen as like some kind of response to the problem of evil, to the argument from evil. And I think part of recognizing that argument as a killer argument, if there's no response, is basically to say that we'd better have something that could be called a theodicy, or else we should give up.
Yep.
And so, the other half of this is though, and I recall the other previous episode of yours that I listened to with Brad Jerzak. Am I saying his name right?
Yep.
I've seen it often. I haven't heard it pronounced that. He was also, speaking out, pretty strongly against theodicy. But at a certain point, I think he even noted that this was happening. That he couldn't help but turn to some account of why God allowed it, and I think at some point he even said, like, "Am I giving a theodicy here?" And maybe. So,
yep.
This, what I'm writing through right now is Rowan Williams has an old paper that he wrote largely against Marilyn Adams. And I forget the full title, but Williams's paper had "redeeming sorrows" in its title. I think that was like the key phrase in the title. I'm trying to explain how it can happen, that even horrific evils are defeated in a certain sense, not just on a global scale, but within the life of the individual who suffers the horrific evil. If you can give an account of how that might be defeated, Marilyn herself, she first wrote a paper called "Horrendous Evils in the Goodness of God," and then later the book of the same title. And in the paper, she was coming off as very anti-theodicy herself. She says, we can't even come up, not only do we not know why God allows it, we can't even come up with possible starts of explanations, something like that. And I was arguing with her, and I'm her student, so I'm seeing this, as she's working on the book. And I made, one of the arguments I'm most proud of. It was a fairly simple one, and I made it to her as she was like rewriting stuff for the book. Was that when you explain how God might not only overbalance the horrific suffering somebody undergoes. And overbalance would be, give them a great afterlife that's more joyful than the suffering was horrible and lasts forever, and it'll just drown it out. It's not just that. It's defeat is where the greater good takes the evil into it, and in a way makes the overall good better for containing that evil.
Yeah.
And if that can be done, that's far more relieving. Like if you're worried about the problem of evil, if you can explain not only how God might overbalance it for somebody, which in a way is just really easy if you've got an afterlife that lasts forever to work with. But if you can also account for how the evil can be taken up into the greater good in such a way that the person themselves wouldn't wish it away. The reason that's more satisfying than just overbalancing, and this was my argument, is because that really does speak to the why God would allow it. Overbalancing how God might overbalance it doesn't help at all. But still, why did he allow the evil? It doesn't begin to really address that. But if you can give an account of how it could not only be overbalanced but defeated, then I think that helps precisely because it does begin to address the why God would allow it question.
Right. Universalism comes into this, I assume, in the sense that God has to defeat it for everybody, or the problem of evil is still devastating.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't, in a couple different ways, you wouldn't need like full universalism. Suppose you would just need, at least, for this problem, all you would need is heaven for everybody who suffers horrific evil in this life. Right. But I think, once you're into that, and look, I think we should just count ourselves all as being likely sufferers of horrific evil. Because whether or not you've suffered any, it's probably in your future. I think I've had friends kid me that I should try to sell this to Hallmark. But what I always say is, if you ever feel guilty because you haven't had your share of life's worst problems, then just remember, someday you will have a problem that gets so bad that it literally kills you.
Yeah.
And I think maybe death itself should just be thought of as a horrendous evil, even if it isn't a particularly painful one.
I think so too. Yes, we're definitely on the same side of that.
So maybe we're all going to be in that class of people who suffer some horrendous evil.
Yeah.
Anyway, the other way in which full universalism isn't needed, and this goes to some of the issues you have, Kyle, with free will, is that, I'm perfectly ready to accept a position on which God's goal is for all to be saved. And I think we should then conclude God will almost certainly reach that goal. But, if you have some people who, through some really weird exercise of free will, end up resisting forever, or maybe resisting to the point where it makes sense for God to give up on them. But God, God's goal is for everyone to be saved, and He almost certainly will hit that goal. And you can say, well, if there are a few holdouts, that might not be that might not count against God's perfect goodness.
Mm-hmm.
If his goal to be saved, and he thought they almost certainly would be, and it was kind of for their sake that he took the chance, and it didn't work out. That's all. That's for me. I would like to still call that universalism, because you think it's overwhelmingly likely that everyone will be saved, and that should be good enough. But I think there's a point somebody could make, a good terminological objection, that, there's a difference between the possibility that I'm wrong about universalism because, theology is hard and I'm not so bright. I could get anything wrong, certainly that's to be distinguished from you're having a position on which, there's some kind of not just epistemic, but like objective chance. Not even God knows, And if you think free will implies that, and I'm open to such thoughts, I have a pretty robust view of freedom and what it entails. And I guess I'm very open to thinking, well, if it really depends on free choices, then no matter how likely it is that all will be saved, even the smallest objective, and not just epistemic, but objective chance that all won't be saved might be enough to make it not true to say all will be saved.
Sure.
And I'm fine with that. That's I could call that close enough to universalism.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not interested in splitting those hairs necessarily. Unfortunately, we're not going to solve the problem of evil tonight. But I do want to...
That's disappointing.
I know, right? To proffer one objection to something that you've said. And this is related to what we're calling the Hitler types, right? The kind of person who really most embodies and exemplifies the kind of habituated character I'm talking about, which is someone who becomes so... I don't know if addicted is the right word. They just become so set in one kind of one train of choices that the good choices are not tempting to them. This is something Aristotle talks about way back, and so that when the good is offered to them, even in kind of piecemeal fashion, it doesn't seem as good to them, and so they're just never going to choose it. Mm-hmm. And in one of the, I think it was one of the blogs that you sent, which incidentally is a blog I used to read. So back in college, I read the Prosblogian, it was called, which is a hilarious pun for anybody that's into St. Anselm.
I had to join just because of how ridiculous the name was.
It was great. And so I used to read that. So I probably read some of your blog posts before I knew who you were. But in one of them, when you're talking about that topic, the Hitler types, if I read you correctly, your general reply to that is that it's kind of based on evidence of this life, right?
Yeah.
The way that evil people will repent in the end seems to be based on the observation that they sometimes repent here.
Yeah.
And so why not after death? Maybe even more so after death, because after death, God has like infinite opportunity to convince them in all kinds of creative ways that God might not have had here. And I'm just not convinced by that. In fact, I think it kind of undermines itself, because maybe I'm just more of an evidentialist than you, or maybe an evidentialist in a different way. I don't know. But it seems to me that the evidence available to any of us strongly predicts that most people won't repent because it's extremely rare even in this life. And in many cases, when it does happen, it's seemingly a random confluence of events that leads to it that no one could possibly have predicted or hoped for. I remember hearing a story of a guy who was a militant, violent white supremacist, a self-described Nazi, in fact, and had a swastika tattooed on the top of one of his hands. And he would sometimes just pick fights with African Americans just for being African American. Extremely violent person, had been to prison many times, and went to McDonald's one time to get some food, as was his norm. And for whatever reason, there was an older African-American woman at the register and was being kind to everyone in line in front of him. And he just felt this compulsion and he's, again, the type of person who would just walk up to African-Americans and pick fights with them, but felt the compulsion for this woman, for some reason, to hide the tattoo. But she had already seen it. And so she just looks him in the face and says, "You're better than that." And it completely unraveled his life. It took a long time and many years, but then he became a kind of equally militant, if you want to use that metaphor, crusader against white supremacy. And that's the kind of encounter, like almost a situational encounter, that no one could have predicted or hoped for, right? And it's extraordinarily rare in this life. And so I just, even granting that God has an infinite amount of time to construct as many such extraordinary that's logically possible. God could give all the possible opportunities that there could be. I still, at the end of the day, have to say, and yet what is the evidence on the ground? And to me, it's extraordinarily rare. And the evidence tells me that it may happen a few times, but nowhere near universally. And so, I just wanted to get your take to that. And my other part of the response to that is, hasn't God already been giving everyone every opportunity? And haven't they already been acting in the ways that they are in light of that fact? And if God hasn't been doing that, what does that say about the character of God? And if God has been doing that, why do we think it'll go different in the future? So I just want to get your thoughts about that kind of counter argument.
Yeah, so I should start by saying the book I'm writing, I just call it 3H because it's horrific suffering, divine hiddenness, and hell. And then it's like the place of free will in a world governed by God. And here we're getting into the middle H, the hiddenness. Basically, I think we have to see this life as one where, insofar as it comes to helping people to make the right decisions, that God's really, in a way, falling down on the job. I mean, he must have good reason to be as hidden as he is in this life. But he really is. And, if you think of this as think of it as God's job to convince, this probably isn't the way God thinks of it, but, if you think part of his job is to convince people to take up this offer, I mean, it's really an extraordinary story. We're trying to get people to buy into. God paid this huge price and wants everybody to be saved, but just can't give it away. I mean, and it's just an incredible story if you think God's doing God's best, because frankly, I could do a better job, given a fraction of God's power. And of course that can't be it. So it's just God is, insofar as the goal of bringing people around into acceptance of God. God must be pursuing other goals because, or at least his pursuit of other goals is limiting the extent to which he's seeking this. Because, if he wanted to do his best just to get wider acceptance without violating people's freedom, surely God could do a lot better than this. So, I'm thinking of this life as being one where, you can think of the God's efforts on this front as being, set down to like level 1 or 2. And, this machine goes up to 11, so what do you think's going to happen when the thing's set to 11 and and is allowed to run forever? So God, part of what God's doing apparently is working largely through us, which seems like a really bad plan.
Right.
A plan of very limited expected effectiveness.
Yeah.
And even some of us are pretty good at bringing around some people who are like really stuck in some horrible ruts. Imagine God. I think you should adapt a point of view in which it becomes almost incredible to suppose that God couldn't and won't bring everyone around while respecting their freedom.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you're much more hopeful on that score than me. But I sincerely hope that you're right and I'm wrong. unfortunately, I think we're at the end of our time. There are many, many more things that I would like to pick your brain about, but I think this has been helpful and might maybe give some people some further reading to dig into to get at a different take than mine, because they just hear me all the time, and that's not good. So, so thanks for coming on and helping to think through some of this stuff with us. And I look forward to reading some more of the stuff that you sent, because I didn't get through it all.
Oh, well, thank you. I could put up on my Yale page, I could put up a thing of links.
That would be amazing. Yes. So you have a Yale page. Where can people find you if they want to read the book you're writing, or if they want to read some of the other stuff that you're doing? Where?
So I will have it set up at campuspress.yale.edu/Keith DeRose, all one word,
Excellent.
/PPWB.
How about that?
There you go. I'll just have links to the various, just basically the links to the things I sent you guys before, and then anybody who's interested can read it. And some of them are just like blog posts from long ago or Facebook notes and stuff. A couple of them are like real papers.
Excellent.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Keith. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. It was fun.
Well, that's it for this episode of A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk Into a Bar. We hope you're enjoying the show as much as we are. Help us continue to create compelling content and reach a wider audience by supporting us at patreon.com/A Pastor and a Philosopher, where you can get bonus content, extra perks, and a general feeling of being a good person.
Also, please rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, and Spotify. These help new people discover the show, and we may even read your review in a future episode, if it's good enough.
If anything we said really pissed you off, or if you just have a question you'd like us to answer, or if you'd just like to send us booze, send us an email at pastorandphilosopher@gmail.com.
Catch all of our hot takes on Twitter at PPWB Podcast, at Randy Nye, and at Robert K. Whitaker, and find transcripts and links to all of our episodes at pastorandphilosopher.buzzsprout.com. See you next time.
Cheers.